Hey everyone, you've got Kevin from Station A here. Today we're going to talk about a key factor in renewable project success, supply chain, a particularly hot topic right now given the pandemic, given tariffs. So to do that, I've invited Michelle Davis from Wood Mackenzie Power and Renewables. Michelle's the principal analyst of U.S. distributed power at Wood Mac, and she agreed to fill us in on the current state of renewable supply chain and share some other insights on the market. Before we get started, Michelle, it'd be great. I'd love it if you could just introduce yourself quickly and then also provide a little bit more context on who Wood Mac is.
Thanks so much for having me, Kevin. Again, my name's Michelle Davis, an analyst at Wood Mackenzie. Wood Mackenzie is a long-standing market research firm that's been involved in the energy space for decades. I've been on the solar side, specifically on the distributed solar side at Wood Mac for over 5 years. And in that time, I've specialized a lot on commercial solar, trying to bring more clarity and useful insights to some of the interesting challenges and opportunities and also nuances of the commercial solar market.
Yeah, and if anybody's ever read anything on the solar space, you have definitely read one of Michelle's reports or at least viewed her analysis. So Michelle is ubiquitous. But maybe to kick things off, I'd love to hear your perspective on like what are the current impacts you're seeing in the renewable supply chain?
Sure. Well, everyone's probably seen in the headlines that supply chains are constrained. So for a bit of context for those of you watching, I'll take you on a brief ride on the solar coaster, let's say. So in 2020, obviously, we had this thing called the pandemic, and most folks are probably aware that a lot of the post-pandemic stimulus funding created this very kind of like lurching type situation in the economy, where after the most brutal impacts of the pandemic passed, we all of a sudden had these insane ramp ups in demand and growth in all kinds of industries. And solar was not immune to being impacted by that. What that's created over the course of late 2020 and throughout 2021 is sort of like overwhelming demand for relatively limited supply of key solar products like modules and inverters. And not only that, but all of the commodities that are inputs to those products, key earth metals, lithium ion for batteries, glass, polysilicon, all of those different elements have also gone up in price because of this insane demand. So things are growing, things are going like crazy, super fast. Then we hit late 2021, the Department of Commerce decides that they want to put a withhold release order on anything coming from the Xinjiang region of China. That sort of like causes a bit of a pause. Folks decide not to ship anything to the US. Then we're in early 2022. This becomes even further exacerbated by the initiation of a trade case. Basically, you've maybe heard of the anti-circumvention case on equipment from 4 key countries in Southeast Asia. That causes chaos in the solar industry. Equipment isn't shipped for months. People are relying on inventory. So you can see quickly how this, solar coaster gets its name. You have insane periods of growth and moving super fast to periods of just, barriers to growth and everything slowing down. So to sort of, answer Kevin's question, the solar industry is very supply constrained, even though President Biden issued an order in June that paused any potential new tariffs that could come out of that trade case, which was a big relief to the solar industry, of course, and that pause will be for 2 years. But prices are still elevated, demand is still very high, and we're still sort of wrestling with actually getting equipment into this country.
The solar coaster has given me many gray hairs over the years. But I'm curious,
Us too.
yeah, can you share just a little bit more about kind of the scope and the scale of these constraints? And is it just limited to those components? Does it expand into other components? And what kind of portion of the total project costs would those comprise?
Some other components to keep in mind for the commercial solar industry in particular is that a lot of developers are reporting issues with transformers. So if you need to order a transformer for your project, the wait times on ordering transformers have gone up quite a bit. And what I typically hear in the industry is it takes about a year to get a transformer. Bit of a sense of how it's impacting price. The typical cost of modules since early 2021 has gone up about 20 cents a watt in the commercial solar industry. What that equates to, I don't have the number right at the top of my head, but the capital stack for commercial solar tends to be, of a $2 a watt project, for example, if your module is say 50 or 60 cents, that's a significant chunk. And then inverter and other electrical equipment on top of that.
We're seeing that live play out. Like we had a buyer move a project forward or want to move a project forward last year. We went to the market, solicited bids through our marketplace. So saw pricing then, exact same project, fast forward 12 months, when they wanted to kind of re-engage and move that project forward, the pricing had changed significantly when we ran that project again through our marketplace. And we saw like similar price increases that you just kind of laid out. I think counterintuitively, the buyer is like, well, the cost of solar just continue to come down. So maybe it's a good idea to wait. But in reality, given the constraints and given kind of what we're living through, we're actually seeing those prices go up. You talked a little bit about like timelines. How is that impacting project timelines?
What we tend to hear in the commercial solar industry over the last year is that projects have gotten delayed about 6 to 12 months. That's just sort of like the average. It will vary a lot depending on the project. There are also developers, larger commercial solar developers who had strong relationships with suppliers to not necessarily be impacted as much by the events of the last year, and they've been able to proceed with their projects for the next year as usual. But that's not the norm. It really kind of depends on the project and on the developer and the types of relationships that they have with their equipment suppliers.
Got it. Do you think it's a dynamic where it's like more advantageous to work with a smaller provider or like a larger provider or developer?
For the sake of equipment, what we've seen is that larger buyers have more purchasing power. So the folks that are doing more capacity in the commercial solar industry, they're going to have direct relationships with manufacturers. They're going to have top priority when it comes to getting equipment. However, I will say that I have heard some interesting nuances around, the big shipments that are being impacted by a lot of these trade issues and are being stopped at ports. Those tend to be the big orders from utility scale solar developers, many hundreds of megawatts. I have heard that for some commercial project developers, because they're making smaller orders, they don't tend to get as much scrutiny at the ports. So they haven't had as many issues with just straight up, having modules detained.
Yeah, that makes sense. When do you see these constraints just going away? Like when will the market correct itself?
We we don't really think until probably sometime in the middle of next year.
Okay.
And that's mostly because of what's currently going on with folks sorting out how to prove to the Department of Commerce that their supply meets the current, laws of the land. I didn't mention this earlier, but the current challenge is getting through the Uyghur Forced Prevention Act requirements. So similar to past instances in the solar industry, it'll probably take several months for folks to get the right paperwork in order, understand what evidence they have to give to the United States government in order to get their modules into the US.
So then if I'm a business and I'm looking and I want to do a project or if I want to do multiple projects, how should I think about the timing of moving those forward? Should I be
Yeah,
doing those now or should I be waiting?
I would say in commercial solar you should just move forward whenever you can, because there's going to be it takes a few years to do a commercial solar project. That's just what people should expect. Even if it's a relatively small sort of like rooftop project, maybe that's only a few hundred kilowatts. There's interconnection issues and things like that at the local level that can take some time. And then there are these equipment issues in terms of just making orders and then getting it to the project. And in the meantime, I'm sure, lots of folks that you talk to, Kevin, are understanding that retail electricity prices are rising. I've heard of some insane increases that are coming down the pike in 2023. So, anything that you can, basically you could have better pricing later, potentially. We don't anticipate prices to really fall for another year or so. But in the meantime, you're just paying higher electric bills.
Yeah, but can you just share a little bit more about that? So the higher electric bills, like what are you seeing? When you say insane, that could be scary.
Yeah. Well, if you look at like the EIA data that they've been issuing recently, the data there is that average retail rates across the country, which of course would be residential and commercial and industrial rates, is like 10% over the last year, which is nothing to sneeze at. But I've heard anecdotes, like for example, New Hampshire is going to have a really big residential retail rate increase in 2023 from like something like the low teens to something in the 30s or 40s for electric retail rates. I've heard from developers in New Jersey that their C&I rate is going from like 6, 7, 8 cents to the low teens. That is a massive increase for a commercial customer in that type of situation. So it's going to be a little bit different everywhere, but the retail price increases over the last year are notable.
Yeah, my goal in all of these conversations is to get somebody to say something around not waiting, because part of our at least theme as a company is to just don't wait. So I'm glad that you're aligned in saying that people should be moving forward, because I strongly believe it's like you just don't know what's coming down the pipe.
Yep.
You could have predicted
Yep.
these price increases. You couldn't have predicted supply chain constraints. You could not have predicted the electricity cost increases as well. Awesome. Just switching gears a little bit. So I'd be curious, still kind of talking on supply chain. I'd love to get your thoughts on how you see the new IRA bill, so the Inflation Reduction Act that everybody's talking about, but more specifically, like how you see the domestic content requirements in that bill impacting supply and supply chain.
The impact of the domestic content adder is actually somewhat difficult to predict right now because the IRS still has to issue guidance on some of the sort of more technical, detailed questions about how you actually qualify for this stuff. So, not to bore you, but basically you have to have 40% of any manufactured components in your project be sourced from domestic supply. There's a lot of questions in the solar industry swirling around if you buy a module that was assembled in the US, but it uses wafers and cells that are shipped from Southeast Asia, will that count? And at this point, the sort of unsatisfying answer is we don't know until the IRS issues that guidance. Hopefully, the interpretation of the rules will be that, yes, indeed, a module assembled here will count to earn that project the domestic content adder. If that is the case, obviously we see that as an upside for the industry. And a lot of that domestic supply that will be built in the US will be in really high demand. Folks are going to, soak up that capacity really quickly because it gives them an extra 10%. But the exact impacts are really going to depend on that IRS guidance.
You're looking at a project as a buyer, so somebody who wants to put solar on their building, and they're talking to different providers. How easy is it, do you think, for providers to hit that domestic content threshold to get the bonus?
My my personal analytical opinion is that it's going to be harder than people anticipate right now.
Yeah.
I think it will also probably take a little while for developers to actually be pursuing that path. I think in the meantime, without answers to some of these questions, developers will just be, developing projects, getting the 30% ITC. That's, it usually takes some time for changes like that in the solar industry to really come into play.
What is like your outlook on the market, and how has that changed?
Yeah, for commercial and community solar, we of course are constantly at Wood Mac looking at state level trends. And one other element of timing for projects is that while there's not necessarily a a rush or like a deadline, now that we have 10 years of the 30% ITC, you may very well live in a state where there are some state level considerations to account for. Incentives might be running out, or programs might have qualification timelines that are shorter. So that's definitely a consideration for you to take into account as well in terms of getting your project started as soon as you can. One of the themes that uh, I've heard from commercial and community solar developers over the last year or so is that they don't have really any bottlenecks to getting interested customers or getting leads. And a big element of that recently has been ESG. The bigger bottleneck is just whether or not you can execute on projects, which then gets down to whether or not the economics work out and whether or not you can make it work with the timing, if there's interconnection issues and studies to get through, et cetera, et cetera. Getting folks sort of like in the pipeline and interested in commercial solar is not really the problem.
A little bit of a humble brag, but I think the reason that we've like the feedback that we've had from providers has been super positive. Not so much that because we're bringing projects to them, but it's because we're bringing like very well qualified projects to
Yeah,
them.
that have a high likelihood of execution. Yeah,
Yeah,
the attrition rates in commercial and community solar are no joke. If anything, that's sort of why I think our forecasts tend to be on the conservative side, because I will see pipelines of hundreds of megawatts, potentially gigawatts,
yeah,
and we discount that stuff heavily.
oh yeah,
Because if history is any guide, only a very small fraction of any of that is actually going to get built, despite seemingly very lucrative incentives.
yeah. That's a classic vanity metric, vanity pipeline. Maybe just one last question to kind of close things out. Let's say I was like your uncle or your brother, or whatever, a family member, and I had a bunch of commercial buildings, and I was like, what advice would you have for me? Like, what would you say?
I would say get some quotes.
You know,
You, there's nothing to lose. There's tons of companies out there that are going to be ready and willing to spend time with you to talk about whether or not you might have a viable building and electricity use profile to make commercial solar worth it. And it, you'll probably get some quotes that are not that attractive, but then maybe you get some that are, and you can kind of see what developers know what they're talking about, maybe which ones that don't, um, and just sort of explore it. It's at least worth exploring, I would say.
yeah, no, definitely. I think we always encourage folks to like quickly transition from the academic exercise of like modeling and thinking, does solar make sense on my building? Um, to actually going to the market, getting quotes, having like a
Yeah,
real conversation about real options.
right. Well, and sort of similarly along those lines, you should ask these developers good questions.
Yeah,
It I know, the reason your company exists is because sometimes bridging that knowledge gap can be really difficult. But a good developer should be able to translate what's going on and answer good questions about their assumptions.
yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a complex transaction, and I think like what we're really
Absolutely.
striving for is to make that as simple and like scalable and frankly fast as possible.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, speed.
yeah. Well, great. Well, thanks so much, Michelle. Awesome to chat. Uh,
Yeah, thank you, Kevin.
yeah.